This is North Pod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Stevenson with his own moves. Cunnington. North are in front.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of North Pod celebrating the career of Ben Cunnington. Obviously finished up on the weekend against Essendon. It's been a couple of days since that game, and I think just thinking about it all, it was, a fantastic way to go out. And I said on the podcast after the game that, I couldn't think of a better way for him to go out aside from getting the win. And I think, it couldn't be more true. I think he's just such a fantastic bloke. So much to like about the way that he went about it. So I'm just going to spend the next 10, 15, 26 hours, whatever it ends up being, kind of talking about, my memories of his career. And yeah, I'm sure there's lots to talk about. Well, I know there is. So just in terms of his quick stats, he played 238 games, kicked 98 goals, was a Sid Barker medalist in 2014 and 2019, and was a runner-up in 2015, 17, 18, and 2021. So quite a tremendous run, really. From 2014 to 2021, he was first or second every year except for 2016. And then in 2020, he was injured for most of the year with that back I think it was a back or a neck, one of the two, and barely played any matches. But yeah, such a dominant period there from 2014 to 2021. Obviously, we know that 2022, he just played the last couple of games, having come back from cancer, and then he played the first however many 6 or 7 matches this year before just having his farewell this week. So yeah, some fantastic numbers there. Obviously would have, if he hasn't had his cancer battle or that massive back injury, he'd be finishing in the 260s, 270s in terms of games played. But an absolute warrior. That 2014, 15, 16 period where we were, in with a chance, he was instrumental in that, and just an absolute contested bull. So yeah, I remember the 2009 draft. He was the pick number 5. It's interesting. That's my year 12 year. So I remember that draft year really, really specifically because, obviously I wasn't any chance being drafted. I wasn't playing footy at this point, but it's kind of that I was at that point in my life where I'm thinking, gee, if I was I'd be getting drafted now if I was a good footy player, if I was any good. So yeah, one of those players that, he took a little while to get going. He pretty much played straight away, but it wasn't until his 5th season where he was hitting that Sid Barker level. 2014, he won it. So I think reflecting on that does make you think that someone like Wardlaw, sure, he's come in and he's been exciting, but even someone like Ben Cunnington took several years to get going and get to that elite, consistent level. So it does take patience. Sheasel has been tremendous this year, but there aren't many that it clicks for that fast. And I wouldn't even say that he was a super slow burn. I just think he took his time. He's never been a super fit runner, but he used his strengths so well. Speaking of his strength, I think we all associate Cunners with the Fend off. There's a few players during the week, or ex-players I should say, like Daisy Thomas, Lee Montagna, that were reflecting on what it felt like to get a don't argue from Cunners. And while I think probably the media and the wider football public would associate Dusty with the Fend off, I think certainly North Melbourne fans would associate that more so with Cunners. There's been a few videos this week of just compilations of him fending players off and just absolutely poleaxing him. And I think reflecting on what his year's been like this year, he has struggled to have that same capacity to fend off. He's given a few off, don't you worry, but he has been more inconsistent with that, and I think that kind of shows that he's really struggled to get back to absolute peak Ben Cunnington form that he had pre-cancer diagnosis. But yeah, just an absolute fend-off beast, and also one of the best handballers I've ever seen. I know, I'm only young. There's been plenty of good handballs in our time or in the AFL history, but had a really great long handball, quick hands out of a contest. Like one, I would say North Melbourne's most damaging handballer in the time that I've watched football. Just, it's worth a kick, if that makes sense, because he was either handballing at 30 metres or he was giving it really quickly to someone who could then kick it 55 metres. Great, such a contested ball winner, clearance beast, and we don't have someone like him in the side to replace him, unfortunately. We've got some contested players, but in terms of clearances, handballing, and strength in fend-off, we don't have that player. But hopefully someone like a Wardlaw can go some of the way to replacing that role. I think, for the last 10 years, it's been Goldstein down to Cunnington, and where obviously both of those players can be moving on either this year or next year. So we need to find, maybe it is Cherry down to Wardlaw. I don't think it is, but we need to find that new combination that's going to take us forward for the next 5 years or so, because Cunnington has just been such a reliable player from that perspective. I think my favourite Ben Cunnington moment on the field, because he's had some big moments. He's had a massive contested possession game. He's had obviously plenty of massive fend-off games, but I think his winning goal against West Coast in Perth 2021 in the wet, I use part of that audio for my intro to the podcast just because I remember it so vividly. Like 2021 was not a good season for us, much like any of the past 4 or 5 seasons, but that win in Perth was massive, and he played such a big part in that with his late goal. That, I think, for me, that specific moment is my favourite memory. He's also had some fantastic finals performances in those 2014 and 2015 years, one of which he won the Sid Barker, and the other he came runners-up, and yeah, I mean, he's absolutely had influence on some of those big matches. Another of my favourite memories of him, the same year that Sid Barker in 2021, I think we all remember that was after his cancer diagnosis. So that he was zooming in for part of the ceremony, and we got a real insight into his emotions, which I think at that point was the first time that we'd really got to see his emotional side, because he was runner-up in the 2021 Sid Barker, only playing, I think it was like 15 games, or maybe it was 17, but he certainly missed quite a lot towards the end of the season. And as part of his, I guess, acceptance or his contribution to the Sid Barker that night, he zoomed in and he was pretty teary, and we've seen that a couple of times now with his retirement speech and a few other things. But at that time, I think that was kind of when the broader football public fell in love with him. There's nothing quite like tragedy to bring people together and to get others around you. I think, unfortunately, that sometimes is what it takes. But that sticks out in my memory really clearly as an iconic Ben Cunnington moment. And I think that was the start of, as I say, people understanding a bit more about who he is as a person, and the fact that, sure, he comes across as this farm bloke that has no feelings, but obviously he does have feelings. He's a human being, and I think he showed a bit of that on that night and in that video. In terms of other things that I could reflect on with Cunners, I mean, another aspect of his game was that he was a fantastic contested overhead mark for his size. Obviously, he's a strong midfielder, but he's not a big, tall midfielder. And I do have there's plenty of memories I have of him just clunking a contested mark or even taking a little mini hanger on the wing. Those hands again. It's just those farm hands. They're so strong and big, and he could take a fantastic contested mark. And I think what we've seen from him so much is that, and it's come up this week a lot. North Melbourne allowed him to just work his strengths. Like his strength was handballing, contested ball. He could take those contested marks, as I said, and he could fend off. We allowed him to excel in using those strengths, and we didn't necessarily worry about the fact that he couldn't cover the ground as well as other midfielders, and he wasn't super fast. Obviously this year it's been hard to have him in the side for that reason, because he really has lost some pace and lost the capacity to run out games. But he's never been that player, and I think that's something that the North Melbourne coaching staff, and I guess Brad Scott was his coach for most of his career, was able to get so much out of him because, as I said, we weren't worrying about what he couldn't do. We were worrying about what he did do and putting him in situations that allowed him to have success with that. So fantastic that we were able to capitalise on that, and it just shows, the sorts of skills that he had in that area. I think obviously I've touched on it, but it would be remiss not to talk about the fact that he's had that testicular cancer diagnosis, and it's recurred. He's had a couple of recurrences, and that's made it really difficult for him to play football over the past 18 to 24 months. But I think, obviously we've all been touched by cancer in different ways. I've had cancer touch people close to me, and it puts things into perspective for you, I think. And you can see that for him and for people around the club and in AFL circles, having he and Sam Doherty kind of go through similar things at a similar time period has been a positive for the AFL industry in terms of what it's allowed people to see, but obviously, not a positive for the people at all. Don't get me wrong. I just think it's showed, or he has showed such tremendous strength to return from that, and he hasn't been back to his best, but Cunnington at sort of 70 or 80% is still a really good player, and we saw that on the weekend. He came back in after having not played at AFL level for a couple of months and didn't look like he'd missed a step, really. It has really, to me, really similar vibes to that Jason McCartney match all those years ago, where he came back after the Bali bombings, and just the fact that he was able to get back and play was enough for him. He retired immediately after the game, which is obviously a little bit different to the way that Ben did it, but I think it is that, a lot of these players that make it to AFL level are so competitive, and I think for Cunners, just the fact that he was able to say, look, cancer didn't beat me, I came back to play, and then I've gone out on my own terms, is, just sums him up, really. He wasn't going to be beaten by it, and just what resilience. I think linking into that, the fact that he was able to play with Wardlaw and kind of pass the mantle on to him in some ways was so good to see on the weekend. I know they're not, exactly alike players, but they're both inside mids. Wardlaw, I think, can run a bit more than Cunnington can, which isn't hard. To see them out there together, and it is a bit of a passing of the baton. We kind of hope as North Melbourne fans that Wardlaw can do what Cunnington's done for the next 14, 15 years for us again, and be that inside contested bull. That remains to be seen. Obviously, a long way to go, and Wardlaw's played 8 or 9 games, but seeing them together there was fantastic to see. Just a couple of final points. I think I've talked about the game. The way that he was interacted with after match and coming off the ground, and seeing all of the North Melbourne players like Simkin and LDU and McDonald helping with carry his kids off, whilst Zeeble and Goldie are actually carrying him off. Like, you could see that both Ben and his family are just so well loved and looked after by people at the club. And I think it's so easy to get swept up in the fact that North Melbourne's been such a poor side over the last several years, and obviously that's super frustrating, and we get angry with the players and we get frustrated, but at the end of the day, they are just, they're just people, and from what I can see from the outside, such a fantastic community of people. Yeah, it was just, it really brought a tear to the eye watching Cunners come off at the end of that game, and the way that, as I say, the players, the coaching staff from both sides, all the fans got around the event, and I think everyone just understood that, we've seen the last of, sure, a great player, but a fantastic person on the football field. I think he's the sort of bloke that you just love to have a chat to. I don't know that he'd love to have a chat to me, and I respect that. I think that he just wants to be his own person and do his job, which he's done a fantastic job of, and then spend time with the family, which is what he's said in his interviews about 75 times this week. Just looking forward to going back on the farm. The last thing that I want to talk about, obviously he was notoriously camera shy, didn't like the media, and didn't like sort of spotlight. And I think it's been great this week that either he's been forced or he's kind of let a bit of media happen. He was mic'd up at training and he's been interviewed several times, and I think it's been great to see a bit more of his personality this week. Even if he hasn't enjoyed it, I think you do kind of have to let it happen in these circumstances and embrace it a bit, and I think he has done that. But I feel like this is going to be pretty much the last that we see of him in the public, I think. I can't see a situation where he's going to be an assistant coach, or he's not going to do a Drew Petrie or a Boomer and go and be a runner. I think this is it for him in football. I'm sure he'll stay in touch with a couple of boys from the club, but I can't see him staying. I think this is it for him in public life, and I think that's fantastic. It's his life to live now. He can worry about whatever it is that people on the farm worry about, and spend that time with his young kids and his wife. Yeah, I just think he and North Melbourne as a club went so well together. We're a low-profile club. No one really cares about us in the big football bubble. And, that probably allowed him to have levels of anonymity, probably at least the first 10 or so years of his career. I think the cancer battle and that kind of thing in the last few years has given the broader public an idea of who he is, but prior to that, I'm sure he could have walked down the street and not get recognised by too many people. I think that's one of the great benefits of being a North Melbourne player. If you are a bit more shy, or you don't want that spotlight, I think it's really worked for him, and it's allowed him to thrive. So I do hope that every now and then he might come down to the club, or we might see him every couple of years in some capacity. But as I said, I don't expect that we'll be seeing him much more than that in the future. And I think he doesn't owe us anything, because he's done such a fantastic job on the field for the past 10 to 15 years. So as I said with Zeebs, all the best, Ben. You've been a fantastic player, one of my favourites over the past 10 or so years, and I wish you all the best. I know you'll be listening to North Pod just like all the players do. And I can't thank you enough, and good luck for the rest of your life. That's it for the pod. Hope you enjoyed this little midweek episode. 2 games to go for the year, so let's stay positive. And I'll talk to you all after the Richmond game, and after we obviously beat them again. We're going to make it 2 years in a row that we upset them for sure. I've got absolutely no doubt at all. Have a great rest of the week, and as always, go Nets. Thanks for listening to another episode of North Pod. Please subscribe to the podcast on your app and give me a rating or a review if you can. I would really appreciate it. You can find me on all social media at North Pod Show. That's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Threads, you name it, I'm there. I'll see you next episode.